start with the breath. We work with that for some weeks, months or longer until the mind becomes more stable, more clear. Then, if we want, we can switch to one of those other objects if we wish. If not, keep going with the breath.
No, is it a sport that I have to develop? Is it a sport like?
What do you mean?
Do I have to finish one stage and I can go to the second stage?
When you say stage, what do you mean by stage? Object?
Object, yeah.
No. No.
No, because you say, Wallace said that when you finish this, you
No, he said that's one possibility you can do, but you don't know. Generally, the general...
It's not development.
No, so the general recommendation is, you know, try various options and see which one really suits you and go with that.
Even nostrils, the basic...
Nostrils. I mean, that's probably the most common out of all of this that's used in Buddhism, the nostrils.
And they will go...
The whole way, the whole way.
So it's not... I don't have to think of in terms of secondary school, university, the postdoctorate.
You can use your nostrils in your postdoctorate thesis. No problem.
I'm relieved.
Because in meditation that I studied to concentrate on the sensation of the body. Like
So I didn't catch the start of it. You learned? No, what?
a meditation.
Yeah, to concentrate on the sensations in the body?
Not of breath, just sensation all over. If
You mean the Goenka scanning?
No, not
Oh, okay.
just be aware of the sensation.
In the
If
body.
It's pleasant,
Sure.
not pleasant or not. It's... Did you make... It's one of the meditations that you did? No.
Not the whole body, no.
Like just pay attention to the sensation, to the feelings. Feeling tone.
Yeah, I mean, but sensations,
Yes.
if we're focusing on sensations, then they're either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So when we notice sensations, we'll notice them as either being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral.
Yes.
And again, we can do that in the whole body, but again, for shamatha, it's good to narrow that down. So that's why we sort of narrow down to abdomen or even to the nostrils. But, you know, we could simply do that, and that will help with mindfulness, just like the open awareness. And of course, we're not to confuse that with, in the Goenka practice, where they scan, because that's a different practice. The scanning, that is a Vipassana practice, because we're noticing the fact that everything in the body is just changing moment by moment. That's what we're doing in that practice. So that's a very different practice than simply noticing sensations in any part of the body.
It helps for noticing the feelings.
Well, feelings in terms of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
Craving or attachment.
As well, yeah, sure, of course. Of course.
Again, if you want to continue the question, if I understand, shamatha is to be able to concentrate.
Is to be,
shamatha
yeah.
is to be able to get to emptiness or to
It's the bait.
control my mind, my thoughts.
Yeah.
Or is it both?
Yeah. So, I mean, the goal of this practice is shamatha. Shamatha is the goal. That's why it's called shamatha practice. And the goal is single-pointed concentration. To be able to focus single-pointedly. Why do we need that? Because in meditation, if we want to go into the Vipassana practice and investigate nature of reality, we need a calm, clear and focused mind. If we don't have that, we can investigate and not get anywhere. We'll get confused, we'll get distracted, fall asleep. We won't be able to do anything. It's like the analogy I gave earlier is that, you know, we're like being a scientist. Scientist who's running an experiment needs to have equipment that is functioning well. If they don't have equipment that's functioning well, they can run an experiment 100 times and get 100 different results. Similarly, if we run the experiment of Vipassana without functioning equipment of the mind, we can get 100 different results. So the equipment of the mind, to make it functioning, is to make it calm, clear and focused. So shamatha practice is to make the mind functional so that we can use it in Vipassana practice.
So if for half an hour, I'm able to concentrate on my breathing, and not being strayed anywhere, then I will be better in Vipassana.
Then if you got distracted all the time, yes, of course.
If I will not be distracted, if I will
Sure.
Be able to concentrate on my breathing, for example, because
Sure.
it sounded as if I continue.
Sure.
Like,
Sure.
This is the basic. But actually, if I only stay with this and I can hold it on for a long time,
Longer, yeah.
then it will be easier to go on Vipassana.
Correct. Correct. And it will be, you'll be able to be more effective in everything you do in your life. You'll have less stress, less mental imbalance, maybe better health, physical health. You know, all of these things are the side effects.
What about money?
Money? No. Well,
On earth,
I wanted to ask, what is the need for Vipassana? Why not just staying with Shamatha when you hear about Zen masters say just sit quietly, do nothing, etc. Why do we need to?
But Zen is also Vipassana.
But as I understood,
Zen has a very special, well, not special, but a different approach. I mean, when they're just sitting, they're not just sort of sitting there in shamatha. They're sitting to gain insight, which is Vipassana.
and it's not like what we've done today, observing the mind or open mind.
And as I think I briefly mentioned, particularly the practice that we've done the last couple of days, either observing the mind or resting in awareness, we can just sit and do that, and then as our mind becomes more clear when we're doing that, maybe we can get spontaneous insight and go like awareness. It's not inside my head. It's limitless. It's not a small thing. In fact, there's nothing outside of awareness. You know, these sorts of insights are Vipassana. And you can get that by just doing this.
Okay.
Normally Vipassana practice is you're explicitly asking these questions and then you're looking. But you could just look and then all of a sudden you go, oh, and you realise that. That's Vipassana.
I will explain.
And that's what they're doing in Zen.
Why I'm asking, I've been practicing martial arts for 25 years, and we're practicing pretty much shamatha. I didn't know that it's called
Sure.
this way, but this
Sure.
is what we do.
Sure.
And when I come back, I want to know if me and my pupils and my colleagues miss something that we need to advance to Vipassana, or shamatha is enough, because this is what the Zen master does.
Well, again, I think the Zen master is doing much more than shamatha. They're doing Vipassana in a very direct way, through just sitting, coming to insights about themselves and the world around them. So this is sort of Vipassana. But in other traditions, they have more explicit in terms of asking certain questions. But also in some Zen traditions, you know, they introduce these koans. And that koan also is to trigger an insight, particularly in non-duality, I think, koans. Because, yeah, to get us out of the dualistic mind. So this is also a mechanism in some Zen traditions for gaining insight. And some others, they're just sitting, and then they just have this sort of spontaneous insight arising, but it's still Vipassana. So Vipassana, of course, is to gain insight into ourselves and the world around us, and we can gain many different types of insights. I mentioned in the various Buddhist traditions, there are sort of four main insights that are focused on. The first one was the impermanence, that everything's changing moment by moment. Another insight was the insight into suffering, or the human condition, dukkha. Another one, of course, is the insight into no self. And then at the deepest level, the insight into emptiness, that nothing exists independently. So all of those, of course, are insights and very helpful in certain ways. And particularly the last one, this insight into emptiness, which we're going to look at in quite some detail in 2 days' time, 3 days' time, then that... See, the thing is that shamatha, because the mind is very calm and clear, will also have the effect that our mental afflictions, irritation, anger, jealousy, craving, it'll sort of put the lid on them temporarily. So while the mind is calm and clear and focused, and we know this from our own experience, when we're in a very calm state in daily life and there's some stimulus, it's harder to get irritated. But if we're sort of a bit agitated, if we're sort of a bit distracted, some little stimulus comes, we explode. So therefore, shamatha will have a positive impact. As long as we're sort of in that calm, clear state, we'll have the positive impact of it being difficult for mental afflictions to arise, but they're still there. Whereas vipassana is getting rid of them. So shamatha is just sort of keeping them a little bit dormant, and vipassana is about cutting them altogether. So that's why we need vipassana. Otherwise, at best, we'll temporarily have a little bit less mental afflictions, but they're still there. And then when the conditions come together,
Thank you.
yeah. Right. Last question, then we'll go to this evening's topic.
So, in continue maybe to this, what you said right now. So, the daily meditation we do on compassion and Tonglen, is
Sure.
it vipassana?
It's the other wing. So there's the two main wings of practice are wisdom and compassion. So, of course, the foundation of all Buddhist traditions is ethics. And then on that basis, we engage in the concentration or the shamatha practice to develop a calm, clear, focused mind. So then the equipment of the mind is functioning now. Now we can use that to gain insights in vipassana, and we can use it to effectively cultivate loving kindness, compassion, bodhicitta, and so forth. So these are the two main wings of practice. And as a beginner, we tend to practice them individually, but actually they're sort of two sides of a coin, really. I think I already mentioned was that when in the vipassana practice, when we come to realize this emptiness, when we come to realize nothing exists independently, what that really means is everything's interdependent. And if we realize that directly, we'll realize there's no gap or boundary between us and anyone else, no separation, which means that the natural, and when we realize that when we come out of that meditation, the natural expression of that is loving kindness and compassion to all living beings. That's the natural expression. So then they're like this. But as a beginner, we need to usually work on them individually because we're not at that point yet.
And so what do you...
So again, if we don't have shamatha, and we try Tonglen or loving kindness or compassion meditation, then we're supposed to do this practice, and then we go, and then we get distracted, and we sort of half asleep, and then nothing penetrates. We don't have any impact in those meditations because we're distracted. But if we're completely there, those practices can really generate a deep sense of loving kindness or compassion that can really penetrate our mind. That's why shamatha is important. Otherwise, if we do these practices, maybe temporarily we have a little taste of kindness or compassion, but then very quickly is gone. Whereas if you have more concentrate, it'll penetrate deeper and it'll last longer. So that's why shamatha is important for the compassion practice. Okay, this evening's topic, we're going to look at, or start to look at, because I want to look at this chart over 2 nights, because there's quite a lot of information there. This is the standard model that you will see in a lot of the shamatha texts in terms of the stages of progress in the shamatha practice. We've touched on briefly a few other models. We saw there's a model of the 4-stage model that we often use for the shamatha practice of observing the mind, where the first stage of practice it's like a waterfall of thoughts crashing down. The next stage of practice, the amount of thoughts slows down a bit. It's like a fast-flowing river. Then the third stage, slow-moving river, and then emptying into a still lake. So that's often a 4-stage model that's presented in the context of shamatha practice observing the mind in terms of the stages we go through in the practice. Whereas this is the sort of, and we can apply this model also to observing the mind as well, But certainly this is really often the standard model that is presented in the text in terms of the stages we go through in the shamatha practice. So let's have a look at the first few stages here this evening. So we've looked at a few things already in this diagram. So the other day we saw down the bottom we have the meditator. In the left hand is a rope. That's the rope of mindfulness, of course, tying our mind with the rope of mindfulness to the object. And the right hand is the hook of introspection. There's quality control to hook the mind back when we notice we've become dull or distracted. We also saw, I think earlier, that the main cause or the main reason we get distracted is we get distracted by pleasurable things, the so-called sense pleasures. And we saw that they are described here in the middle of the chart, the 5 sense objects. Remember, the bowl of fruit there is taste. To the right of that, the silk cloth is touch, tactile. Above that, the 2 round objects, symbols, is sound. To the left of that is the shell with some perfume in it, that's smell. And then diagonally above that, the round object is a mirror, is the visual. So these are the 5 sense objects that are the most common form of distraction.
Where's the touch?
The touch, the silk cloth above the elephant, the second elephant up. There's a silk cloth there. And then we also I briefly mentioned, I think, that the flame. So along this windy road to Shamatha, we see down the bottom the flame is very big, and as we go around the stages, it gets smaller and smaller and eventually disappears. So the flame is the amount of effort we need to put in our mindfulness, in holding the object and in monitoring that. So what we find, of course, is that at the beginning stages, our mindfulness and introspection are not very well developed, so we have to put a lot of effort to work with them. But at the higher stages of the practice, the flame disappears, meaning now our mindfulness and introspection are very well developed, meaning that they're spontaneously operating. We don't have to put effort to have them operating.
Still the fire on the top, on the right.
I'll come to that tomorrow. The short answer is this is not shamatha, this is vipassana. So in vipassana we have to put effort, that's why the flame is there. But I'll talk more about that tomorrow evening. So then the elephant here, stage 1. So if we actually just briefly go over to the next page, in the top we have that sentence we looked at earlier in the retreat. Shamatha is attained by progressing through the 9 stages, relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. So we saw those 5 faults and those 8 antidotes. Again, the 2 main tools there of mindfulness and introspection. So we're progressing through these 9 stages, and the goal of shamatha is the diagram in the middle at the top. We're going along this windy road, and this windy road, each straight part of the road is called a power. That's what we use to move through that particular stage. So the first straight road here at the bottom is called the power of hearing, which means to get into the practice, we have to hear the instructions. We have to understand what to do. So we hear the instructions, we apply them, and we start practicing. And stage 1 here at the bottom is called setting the mind. Now the elephant is the mind. The fact that it is black is symbolizing this dullness or laxity. The monkey is conceptual discursive thought in general, and the fact that it's black is symbolizing this excitement.
What is a monkey?
Is conceptual thought, is thought in general. And the black colour is this excitement, is the most common form of distraction. So what we see at stage 1 here is that the elephant and monkey are running wildly ahead of the meditator. Meaning that at the first stage of practice, what we really know, what we see or experience is that our mind is completely out of control. That we try to focus on the breath, and let's say we're using the object, let's say we're using the breath. We try to focus on the breath, maybe a couple of seconds, and then off we go on some story, some distraction. And then usually it's only some long time later, maybe some minutes later, We go, oh, hang on, I'm supposed to be on the breath. We come back to the breath again for another couple of seconds, and then off we go again. So that is describing the first stage, that we are hardly on the object. Most of the time we're completely distracted. Now, of course, what often happens at this first stage of practice is that when this happens, people have the impression that they can't meditate. I can't meditate. In fact, I must be doing something wrong, because before I started meditating, my mind was sort of okay, but now it's completely out of control. I must be doing something wrong. You're not doing anything wrong. You can meditate, you're making progress. Because until we sit down and try to focus on an object like the breath, we may have this idea that my mind is sort of okay, but when we do this, we realize that actually our mind is completely out of control. And so actually this is the first sign of progress, is simply noticing how chaotic and out of control my mind really is. So that is stage 1 here. And then, of course, if we keep meditating, we'll go around the corner and we have stage 2. The second road here is the road of thinking or contemplating. So by thinking or contemplating about the practice, and particularly understanding the benefits of the practice and so forth, we can then go get more enthusiasm to the practice and understand the practice better. We can start to progress a little bit more in the practice. And at the second stage here, which is called continuous setting, what we notice is that the elephant and the monkey are not running so fast anymore, and they have a little bit of white on the tops of their heads. And so that white is symbolizing these factors of stability and clarity. So by the second stage of practice, what we notice now is that there are periods in our meditation where our mind is calming down a little bit, and we're starting to be able to focus a bit better on the object. So at stage 2, maybe we can focus on the object for a minute or two before we're distracted. But still at stage 2, we tend to be distracted for long periods of time. So even at stage 2 of the practice, we tend to be more off the object than on the object. And then, of course, if we continue to practice, we go around the corner to the next straight road, which has stage 3 and 4 on it. This is the road of mindfulness. So now our mindfulness is improving quite a lot. And by stage 3, we notice now that the rope of mindfulness is tied to the elephant of the mind. And we notice 2 things in particular here. First is that the elephant is turning its head backwards. What that means is now at stage 3, due to our mindfulness being a lot better, when we get distracted, we quickly recognize that we're distracted and we quickly come back to the object. So that's symbolized by the elephant turning the head backwards. We quickly come back to the object. But also at stage 3, we notice another thing is now there's a rabbit on the back of the elephant. The rabbit is symbolizing what's called subtle dullness, subtle laxity. And from stage 3, we need to be aware of this. Because at stage 3, now we're focusing quite well on the object, maybe 5 or 10 minutes before we're distracted, and we quickly come back if we are distracted. So it seems like we're progressing very well, and we are, but we may think that we're sort of actually maybe getting close to Shamatha. And even though our mindfulness is getting a lot better, still the quality of our attention needs a lot of work. So therefore, we need to pick up this subtle dullness, that our mind is not very sharp or clear. If we don't pick up the fact that our mind is not sharp or clear, we'll get stuck there. We won't progress further. So from stage 3 now, we need to notice that. That's that subtle dullness. And then if we keep practicing and our mindfulness continues to improve, we'll get to stage 4 here, which is called close setting. So at stage 4, now mindfulness is getting a lot better, meaning now at stage 4 we can hold the object the entire session without ever losing it. But of course we still have a lot of work to do on the quality of our attention. And of course, as I mentioned I think earlier, we are always emphasizing quality over quantity. So therefore when we start shamatha practice, we start by doing short sessions. And that's what we've been doing in this retreat, 15 or 20 minutes a session. And so as a beginner, that's probably a good amount of time to roughly to use, somewhere around that number, 15 or 20 minutes. But as we start progressing along to particularly stage 3 and 4, we'll need to increase the duration of our meditation to progress further. So by stage 4, we can probably meditate for up to an hour in one session, but always emphasizing quality over quantity.
What happened to the rabbit?
Sorry?
What happened to the rabbit?
The rabbit is still there at stage 4. So maybe I can briefly mention stage 5 and 6 today as well. So then if we keep practicing, we'll go around the corner to the next road, and this is called the road of introspection. Because here by stage 4, mindfulness is well developed, meaning we can hold the object the entire session without ever completely losing it. But now we need to improve our quality control, introspection. We need to more and more closely monitor the mindfulness in terms of agitation and a little bit of dullness. So here over the middling stages, stage 5 and 6, we see the hook of introspection now is prominent, meaning that now we are fine-tuning our focus. In the early stages, particularly stage 1 and 2, we were completely distracted or half asleep. So we were just coming back to the object continuously because we're gone completely dull or completely distracted. But now over these middling stages, we can hold the object the entire session, but still we need to fine-tune the focus. And here in the middling stages, often the analogy that is used or given is that the analogy of a guitar string. If a guitar string is too tight or too loose, it doesn't play well. Guitar string? Guitar string? Yeah. If it's too tight or too loose, it doesn't play well. Likewise, if our mind is too tight or too loose, it doesn't focus well. So we are constantly here fine-tuning our focus, meaning if our mind is too tight, agitation will arise, so we need to relax. If we relax too much, dullness will set in, so we need to sharpen the focus. So we're doing this balancing act and to finer and finer levels. So this is what we're doing over these middling stages here.
Where is it? Which number is it?
Well, I'm using stage 5 and 6, the two in the middle here, to talk about that. We see the hook of introspection there in stage 5 and 6. So in stage 5 and 6 we are really in these middling stages. It's more about really just fine-tuning the focus. We may have noticed even here in the early stages of our practice that we can be focusing on the breath, but somehow at the same time be thinking about all sorts of other things. So that's a lot of like background static there. Even to the point now where actually the main thing we're focusing on is some other thing, and then a little bit in the corner of our mind we're still sort of focusing on the breath a little bit. So this can even happen in stage 4, because we're never completely losing the breath. So over these middling stages we are shifting that so that the main focus is the object and less the other things that are interfering with that focus. We're less and less involved in those. So we're fine-tuning that balance to more and more subtle degrees. So that's all I wanted to cover this evening on this chart. We'll look at the last 3 or 4 stages there tomorrow evening, and I wanted to also talk about that